The Gunnison country. The name had a ring to it even 100 years ago. Located on the western slope of Colorado, deep in the Rocky Mountains, the region has always been influenced by geography and weather. Surrounded by 14,000-foot-high mountains and subjected to cold and heavy snows, the Gunnison country was starkly beautiful in its isolation during the early years. The boundaries of the Gunnison country were and are rugged and breathtaking. To the east, the top of Monarch Pass at 11,312 feet forms one of the limits. To the south, the early center of the San Juan country, Lake City, holds forth. The western border is Cimarron, early cattle center and important Denver and Rio Grande Railroad station. The northern perimeter halts at the rugged and unique town of Marble, located in the Elk Mountains, over 50 miles from Gunnison. Within these boundaries rest fertile valleys, lush with grass and perfect for the Gunnison country's world-famous cattle industry. They include the Gunnison, Tamichi, East River, Quartz Creek, and Cochetope valleys, all watered by snow-fed mountain streams. The Gunnison country has always been a land of extremes. Snow has fallen in the Elk Mountains to the north in amounts exceeding 350 inches, causing two-story outhouses and 20-foot-high clotheslines to be built in towns like Crested Butte. 60 degrees below zero has been recorded at the Taylor Reservoir to the northeast. The Gunnison country is famous for its cold temperatures, but its lack of humidity, little wind, and perpetual sunshine allows the region to feel much warmer than the temperature indicates. In this magnificent high country setting, the Gunnison country contains the largest body of water in Colorado, 9 miles to the west, the Blue Mesa Reservoir, famed for its outstanding fishing, windsurfing, and boating. Just outside of Lake City is Lake San Cristobal, the second largest natural body of water in Colorado. Mention the Gunnison country and people around the Rocky Mountain West will tell you about some of the finest deer and elk hunting in the nation, great skiing at Crested Butte and Monarch, and hundreds of ghost towns, monuments to the once great mining frontier of the region. But most of all, the Gunnison country is famous for its geographic panorama. Spectacular Elk Mountains outside of Crested Butte, Sawatch Mountains overlooking Taylor Park, and the rugged and beautiful San Juans near Lake City are truly breathtaking. The Gunnison country, a proud land, a great land. Its geography and weather have always controlled the destiny of that rugged mountain region, and they always will. Behind me, the Gunnison Valley, with Round Mountain, the Anthracite Range, and Mount Carbon as backdrops. This was a place the Ute Indians called home hundreds of years ago. As the white miners entered the Gunnison country in the 1860s and 1870s, one great obstacle stood in their path. The Ute Indians, Colorado's oldest continual residents, had lived in the valley for hundreds of years. The Utes were nomadic wanderers following the deer, elk, and buffalo herds throughout western Colorado. They stayed in the high country in the summer, but when winter began to set in, moved to milder climates like the Uncompahgre Valley. When the San Luis Valley was settled, the Utes were moved into western Colorado, and the Los Pinos Indian Agency was established 30 miles southeast of today's Gunnison. There the Utes stayed until 1875, when they were moved to Kelowna, 12 miles south of present-day Montrose. To supply the Indians with their beef, the United States government established a cow camp in 1871 near the juncture of the Gunnison and Tamichi rivers. The Spanish called that juncture Dos Rios, the meeting of two rivers. There, Josiah White, James Kelly, Sidney Jocknick, and Alonzo Hartman tended 3,000 head of cattle and 2,000 head of sheep. Following the Ute removal, Hartman established one of the most famous ranches in the history of the Gunnison country and became one of the state's top cattlemen. The great mining rush in the San Juan in the 1870s spelled doom for the Utes. They were forced to give up that area by the Bruneau Treaty of 1873, and following the Meeker Massacre by the White River Utes in northwestern Colorado in 1879, they were moved out of Colorado altogether. Sadly, the Indians rode their ponies to Utah, victims of the white man's desire for the mineral wealth and rich lands that they owned, and thus passed the Ute Indians from the Gunnison country forever.
We weren't tied down too much to our home. We're kind of like more like Roman types Indians and so forth. We roamed the whole area, and that's why I said we traveled with the four seasons, whatever. And when we noticed the change of climate, we'll look at the indication from this whole earth that indicates time to move on, so we move on.
For the people that used to live here, as to here today and back then in the old way, it's kind of like, you know, you look at it as a lifeblood of our Mother Earth. Because again, we look at the land, the mountains here as our relatives and our mother. And in this way, we look as we're the caretakers of the Rocky Mountains here.
Way through, long time ago. That we got new to you, we through men together. We used to roam around through this whole valley. Then tabu and tupu do regular trade. Te upu tabu menu kute. Keep the tupak thing, keep the map qua. Cause this was once our land one time. Well, we roamed around all over this whole valley. Micah knows.
Following the Utes into the Gunnison country were the mountain men. Their era of history was brief, from 1807 to 1842, but they played a very important role in opening up this area. These rugged men of the West were everywhere in the central Rockies, and they were in the Gunnison country. Here they trapped rivers like the Gunnison, Tamichi, East, Slate, Cochetope, Quartz, and Lake Fork. They were colorful characters with unique garb. They were decked out in buckskin pants and shirt, moccasins, a beaver hat, and around their waist they wore a thick belt to hold a large knife and occasionally a single-shot pistol. A stringer around their necks held their tobacco pouch and gunpowder, and all mountain men were equipped with a hawk and rifle. They lived incredibly lonely lives and faced many dangers in the mountains. Many died at the hands of Indian warriors. Some were drowned in swollen rivers in the spring, and accidents and pneumonia also took their toll.
Well, it was a tough life. If and they could keep their hair, they still had to deal with trying to make a living. They had to have a place to sleep. You know, they'd sleep under a tree or pretty much wherever they'd come up with. What they had for tools was whatever they could carry that they could rely on. They might have them a pack horse, but they never knew if that horse is going to be with them at the end of the day or not.
When the settlers started coming west, the mountain man era was about over. Furs were trapped out pretty much in most areas, and silk had become the rage of the age by that time, and it got to the point of the beavers weren't bringing anything. That's why they always say the beaver will shine again.
The fur trade ended in the Gunnison country in the American West by the mid-1840s. The overtrapping of the streams, Indian hostility, and a change in fashion from the beaver hat to the silk or felt hat marked the end of one of the most colorful eras in American history. The year was 1848 and the Mexican War was over. The United States had picked up the entire American Southwest, including Colorado, and now there was a big need to take a look at what the United States had picked up. And that meant that the day of the explorers was at hand. The most famous of the pathfinders was John Charles Fremont, who made 5 trips to the American West between 1842 and 1853, one of which came through the Gunnison country en route to California. And there were others with names like William Gilpin and Randolph Marcy and Edwin Beale. All searched for good overland trails which would provide easy access between the towns of the Mississippi River and the West Coast. By 1853, it was determined that the best route west ran through Colorado over the low Cochetope Pass, the Pass of the Buffalo, and the central route to the Pacific, they called it. However, the greatest exploring expedition ever to pass through the Gunnison country made its way into this region in 1853 and was led by a 41-year-old native named John Gunnison of New Hampshire. Gunnison was one of 4 explorers sent out by the United States government in 1853 and followed the old Santa Fe Trail for a while before veering off and crossing Cochetope Pass into the Gunnison country in September of that year. As he made his way through the valley west, he was stunned to see the Black Canyon, an impassable gorge. By mid-September, Gunnison and his party of over 60 men had left the Gunnison country and were going through the Uncompahgre region en route to Utah. On October 25th in southwestern Utah, Gunnison and 7 of his men were killed by Paiute Indians while eating breakfast, and thus ended the exploring expedition of the man whose name would be used to describe today's Gunnison country. The great amount of publicity surrounding Gunnison's death led to the naming of the Gunnison country in his honor. Sadly enough, Gunnison's trip accomplished little. Though Cochetope Pass was a natural gap for a railroad line, no transcontinental railroad ever crossed it. There'd always been rumors of gold in the Gunnison country. The Spanish, working their way north from Taos and Santa Fe, New Mexico in the old days, had spoken in hushed terms of the Gran Quivira and the lost Spanish mine legends. In 1848 and 1849, Argonauts coming in from the Midwest and heading for California also passed through the high mountain streams of western Colorado and found traces of gold. 15 to 20 years later, many of them came back, and the placer mining boom of the Gunnison country was underway. The gold was found in the rushing streams of the western slope of Colorado and the Gunnison country. And the people who panned for the gold were called placer miners or gold panners. Working on the side of a stream, they would fill their pan with rocks and debris and hopefully gold. And then on the bottom of the pan, they would throw the rocks out and they would pick out the dirt in the bottom of the pan that paid, and they called it pay dirt. Placer miners' entries into the Gunnison country were Lake Pass and into Taylor Park, Marshall Pass into the upper Tomichi Valley, and Cochetope Pass. Rich strikes were made along the mountain streams, but the top placer mining camp soon became Minersville, located up Washington Gulch north of Crested Butte. Other rich gold placer regions in the Gunnison country were found near Pitkin along Quartz Creek and in the streams north of Crested Butte. The men doing the panning never numbered more than 2,000, and they were in the Gunnison country only during the 1860s. Then, towards the end of that decade, the Ute Indians and the isolation moved them out forever. However, these hardy men had given the world its first real glimpse of the Gunnison country. The year was 1873, and Ferdinand Hayden's survey team was in the Gunnison country, the first group ever to study that exciting area scientifically. Hayden's group, however, was only part of the great survey teams in the American West from 1867 to 1879. Others included John Wesley Powell, George Wheeler, and Clarence Rivers King, and they covered the West like a blanket during that 12-year period. Hayden divided his surveyors into 6 groups, working widely apart. During their 3 years in the Gunnison country, they covered every nook and cranny of that region. With them was William H. Jackson, the greatest photographer in the country, who recorded on glass plates the stunning panoramas observed. A mountain outside of Crested Butte, Emmons, was named for one of Hayden's men. In fact, the name Crested Butte was given to that high mountain town by Ferdinand Hayden, who referred to Gothic and Crested Butte mountains in his report as the Crested Buttes. Taylor Park, the Black Canyon, Cement Creek, the Gunnison Valley, the Los Pinos Indian Agency, and the Elk Mountains were only some of the regions covered by Hayden before he left the Gunnison country in 1875. As the light of 1875 dimmed, the age of innocence passed in the Gunnison country. Now ranchers, town promoters, miners, and speculators were en route. The place would never be the same again. This is Lake San Cristobal with the San Juan Mountains in the background. The lake was carved out about 700 years ago when the side of a mountain broke loose, roared downhill, slammed into the lake fork of the Gunnison River, and created this magnificent body of water, the second largest body of water in Colorado, called Lake San Cristobal. The slide that came down on the mountain on that day 700 years ago was called the Slumgullion Slide. From Lake San Cristobal in 1874, the miners coming into the San Juan country worked their way up the lake fork of the Gunnison, passing through the emerging mining camps of Carson, Capital City, and White Cross until they topped out on top of Engineer Pass at 12,800 feet. From there, they dropped down into Silverton and Ouray, and the great mining boom of the San Juan was underway. This is Lake City behind me, and it looked a lot different in 1876 at the peak of the San Juan mining boom. 2 years before, the town of Saguache in the San Luis Valley had hired Otto Mears and Enos Hotchkiss and a survey crew to build a road all the way through Lake San Cristobal and up over Engineer Pass into Ouray and Silverton. That was to get the supplies into those newly emerging mining camps and the ore out. Lake City in 1876 became the county seat of Hinsdale County, a town of 2,500 people with smelters and a railroad coming in. It was the height of the San Juan mining boom. This is Lake San Cristobal, the scene of one of the most infamous events in Colorado history. The year is 1874, and a veteran Pennsylvania prospector by the name of Alfred Packer and 5 companions left a site near Delta, Colorado, en route to Breckenridge, where they hoped to hit a big gold strike. They were out 66 days, and when Alfred Packer arrived at the Los Pinos Indian Reservation in April of 1874, he was alone. His 5 companions nowhere to be found. On August the 9th, 1874, a few months later, a photographer for the Harper's Weekly magazine found 5 bodies, all partially eaten, at a site called Cannibal Plateau. Alfred Packer, who had been lodged in the Saguache jail during the summer, escaped. 9 years later was found and brought to trial at the Hinsdale County Courthouse in Lake City. He was tried and convicted on 5 counts of murder, and the judge, in passing the sentence, supposedly uttered the famous words, "There were 7 Democrats in Hinsdale County, and you voracious man-eating SOB, you ate 5 of them. I sentence you to be hanged by the neck until you're dead, 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 as a warning against reducing the Democrat population of this state." It was 1878, and there were vibrations in the Gunnison country. In that year, the San Juan mining boom began to ebb, and the great carbonate camp called Leadville began to boom. As miners from Silverton, Telluride, Lake City, and Ouray began to filter into the Gunnison country, those from Leadville had the same idea. After all, if there was rich silver in the Saguache Mountains, why not in the adjoining Elks? On the horizon as 1879 opened were the glory days of the Gunnison country. Expansion, growth, booms, excitement, great wealth, and even greater expectations. From across the Continental Divide, from Saguache and the San Luis Valley, from all the other states of the Union, and from foreign countries they came. All roads led to the Gunnison country as spring made its entry in 1879. By the spring of 1879, earlier rumors of gold and silver, the removal of the Ute Indians, and promising strikes of the year before led to a wild mining rush into the Gunnison country. When the placer miners left the Gunnison country in the 1860s, the area was quiet for over a decade, and then cries of silver echoed through the mountains, and thousands of prospectors flocked into new mining towns like Irwin and Tin Cup and Gothic, Pitkin, and White Pine. The greatest of all the mining camps in the Gunnison country was Ruby Irwin, and the greatest of all the mines in Ruby Irwin was this one, the Forest Queen. It was found by Dick Irwin during the summer of 1879 and ultimately produced $1 million worth of silver ore. 5,000 or so prospectors in Ruby Irwin stayed until 1893 when the silver panic hit. One of the great problems in Ruby Irwin was early summer storms, which shortened up the mining season greatly. And oftentimes the miners never got in until May or June and then were shut down as early as November. From 1879 to 1881, 25 to 40,000 people swarmed into the Gunnison country over every pass imaginable. These tremendous numbers forced consideration of smelters, railroads, and permanent towns. The rush had been a wild one and made Gunnison country a term which excited the imagination of miners across the country. A great mining kingdom had been uncovered, and the only unanswered question was, how rich was this mountain bonanza? The railroads are very important to the Gunnison country. In 1881, with thousands of miners scattered throughout mining camps in this area, there was a great need to get the supplies in and the ore out. And that was the job of the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad. William Jackson Palmer's line, built over Marshall Pass in the summer of 1881, came down the Gunnison Valley and came into Gunnison on August the 8th, 1881. This is the Denver South Park and Pacific Railroad grade, and behind me, the Palisades and the road to the Alpine Tunnel. In the year 1882, the Denver South Park Railroad began building from Denver, came through South Park, up Chalk Creek Canyon, and through the highest railroad tunnel in the world, the Alpine Tunnel, 11,523 feet high. The tunnel was 1,771 feet long, had an east portal and a west portal, and from this area, the railroad came down through the Palisade rockwork, descending through the railroad grade and on down into Pitkin. From Pitkin, it went to Parlin, from Parlin down the Gunnison Valley and into Gunnison, arriving in 1882, the competitor of the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad. This is the East River Valley, and behind me, Mount Teocalli. This is an area where the Gunnison country cattle industry began to boom in the 1880s with the advent of mining. With 25 to 40,000 people entering the Gunnison country in mining camps such as White Pine, Pitkin, Tin Cup, and Crested Butte, there was a great demand for beef, especially before the advent of the railroads. and thus in the late 1870s and the early 1880s, thousands of cows roamed in the valleys around Crested Butte. When the railroads came in, the ranchers would get their cows together in the fall of the year in what they call pools and ship them over Marshall Pass and on into Denver. But in the early days, the beef was used locally to supply the mining camps. Today, the Gunnison country cattle industry is still vibrant, with many major ranches surrounding the Gunnison and Tomichi valleys. This is Crested Butte, one of the Gunnison country's most famous mining communities, surrounded by a magnificent panorama of peaks, all in the Elk Mountains: Mount Whetstone, Axtell, Gothic, Crested Butte Mountain. Placer miners were in the Crested Butte region as early as the 1860s, but it took the silver mining boom of the late 1870s to bring in the first permanent population. Very early, Crested Butte was known as the gateway to the Elks. It was the supply town for the great silver mining camps which surrounded it. But Crested Butte's destiny did not rest with silver, but rather with high-grade coal. The Jokerville was the first great mine in town, but in 1884, a violent explosion caused by seeping methane gas destroyed the mine and killed 60 miners, one of the worst mining disasters in the history of Colorado. The Denver and Rio Grande Railroad, a narrow gauge line, had arrived in Crested Butte in November of 1881, and as one coal mine after another began to open, long trains of coal could be seen passing through the East River Valley. 9 major mines were worked during the peak years of Crested Butte, and 154 coke ovens produced the much sought-after coking coal used in the production of steel. After the 1880s, it was not uncommon to see major coal trains going from Crested Butte and down the East River Valley and into the CF&I steel mills in Pueblo. Crested Butte has also been known for its great ethnic heritage. Yugoslavians, Austrians, Italians, and Czechoslovakians came into Crested Butte, and the noise that one heard in Crested Butte during those early days and all the way through the 1950s when the mines closed up was not only the noise of the mills and the noise of the coal mines, but also the noise of the roaring polkas played in one bar after another in Crested Butte. The coal mines closed up in Crested Butte in the 1950s and the railroad was pulled out, and Crested Butte seemed to be in despair as to how to make a living. But in 1961, Dick Eflin and Fred Rice began the Crested Butte ski area, starting off with a T-bar in that year and going to a gondola during the season of 1962 and 3. The Crested Butte ski area has gone through some trials and tribulations since that time, but beginning in the 1970s became one of the major ski areas in Colorado. Throughout the history of the Gunnison country, Gunnison has always been the hub of activity. Established as an agricultural colony in 1874, the town barely survived until transformed overnight by the silver boom of 1879 to 81. All roads led to Gunnison during that exciting time. From a sparsely populated, lonely sagebrush hamlet containing log huts, board shanties, and tents, Gunnison was turned into a roaring boom town overnight. Stores and homes were built. Saloons, gambling dens, and houses of prostitution meant a great red light district, and Gunnison became the place to be. The Denver and Rio Grande and the Denver South Park and Pacific Railroads arrived in 1881 and 1882. Major smelters were built, and by the mid-80s, Gunnison had between 6,000 and 8,000 people. The 4-story La Vida Hotel, built in 1884 for $250,000 and complete with crystal chandeliers, Persian rugs, teak and mahogany, and gold lace, was one of the finest in Colorado. Gunnison became the metropolis of western Colorado, and there were those who felt it might become the capital of the state. The Gunnison country has had a rich and storied past highlighted by mining booms, a famous ranching industry, recreation and tourism, and Western State College. But what of the future? Where does the Gunnison country go from here? First and foremost in importance is water. The Gunnison country has enormous water reserves coming from high mountain snowpacks. The western slope of Colorado has 7% of the state's population, 33% of the land area, and 70% of its water. And therein lie many tales of woe. The water is where the people aren't, and the people aren't where the water is. The good news is that the Gunnison country does have much water. The bad news is that everybody wants it. Denver, Colorado Springs, and other Front Range cities are voracious and determined in their quest for the rich water resources of the Gunnison country, and yet water is the key to the survival of this area. The many cattle ranches which dot the Gunnison country are still viable segments of the region's economy. This is an industry which has persisted for almost 120 years, one which is famous for its breeding stock and fine beef. The lore of cattle ranching, its irrigated hay fields, branding, calving seasons, high country grazing, and cattlemen's days in July account for much of the history of this region. Western State College, started in 1911, has brought a cosmopolitan approach to this region. Today, the college has 2,500 students from nearly every state in the Union and also from foreign countries. It has helped make Gunnison County one of the top 10 educated counties in the nation. The Gunnison country's magnificent beauty highlights another major economy, recreation and tourism. The Blue Mesa Reservoir, 9 miles west of Gunnison, has over 100 miles of shoreline and is the state's second largest tourist attraction. The Gunnison country is famous for its hunting, fishing, skiing, windsurfing, mountain climbing, boating, and mountain biking. Others enjoy four-wheel drive excursions to the hundreds of mining camps which once dotted the mountain landscape. The cool summers, beautiful falls, winter wonderlands, and refreshing springs lure tourists in during all seasons of the year. But most important to the Gunnison country is its abundance of natural resources. The previously mentioned water is perhaps the greatest resource, but this region is a virtual storehouse of coal, molybdenum, granite, marble, and uranium. All will certainly be used in the future. We have now had a good look at the Gunnison country, a land rich in history, natural resources, and beauty. Today it stands as a beacon of light to those who wish to enjoy the great outdoors. Hayden never forgot the Gunnison country, and in his fading years through the mists of time remembered the majestic Elk Mountains, the deep gorge called the Black Canyon, and that magnificent panorama that he had seen.